So good to have you here, Joel.
Thank you very much. It's an honor of mine to meet you. I know. I'm sure you get that a lot, but
not at home, not in the office. I can't think of anywhere.
Well, look, I've been working with consumers since I was a teenager. So one of 4 kids in Boston, son of a military guy, and then later in life a lawyer. And so, if you wanted to...
Later in life, your dad was a lawyer?
My dad was, yeah.
Was he a lawyer in the military?
No. He was actually a naval aviator in Vietnam, and then he came back and he went to law school.
What did he fly in Vietnam?
F-4s. He was a navigator, so he was the backseat guy in F-4s. Yep. And my younger brother was a F-18 pilot in Afghanistan and Iraq, actually, and he was on the single seats.
Wow.
Yeah. I've accomplished a lot in my life, but when I think about those 2 guys, I basically think I've accomplished nothing. So it's remarkable.
Different.
Yeah.
On a flight back home last night, I was watching a 20-some-odd minute segment of Top Gun. But just the scenes of those naval aviators, just amazing. And a good buddy of mine was a A-5 pilot in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I had a chance to visit with one of my heroes in Fred Smith.
Yeah.
So Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx,
yeah.
Remarkable company.
Yeah.
My brother asked me last night, he says, what's the market cap of FedEx? I said, I think it's $45 or $50 billion.
Yeah.
But more than that, it's just a remarkable company. Fred told me yesterday his favorite picture of that time is a desolate Wall Street, except for one FedEx employee pushing a cart with a bunch of packages, and it's the only human being in sight on desolate Wall Street.
Yeah.
And he says just so poignant for him.
Yeah.
When I last saw him was about 2 months ago. I was privileged to be in an audience at J.P. Morgan that was hosted by Doug Petno of a group he calls the Founders Forum.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always an interesting group of characters, and I'm privileged to be invited to it. And Fred Smith was the evening after dinner fireside chat speaker.
That's great.
With another hero of mine interviewing him, Ken Langone.
Oh, yeah.
And at the Q&A portion at the end, someone in the audience asked, what role should CEOs play in terms of voicing opinions about public and political matters?
Yep.
And Fred's point of view, I'll characterize it in my own inept way. Basically, you should lead by example and stay out of the political moment. Except the next question was, do you have a point of view around firearms, in particular automatic weapons and these high-capacity weapons? And he said, on that one, I have to weigh in. He says, I don't know if there's another, but I'm one of the few for sure CEOs who's had experience with those weapons. He did 2 tours as a Marine in Vietnam, once as a platoon member or once as a platoon leader. Mm-hmm. And he said, so I'm unique in the respect that as a military person and officer, I've both used those weapons in war and been the recipient of their incoming. And he said that they're meant for one thing. He says they're meant to kill and maim and mass numbers as quickly as possible. And he said there's just no place for these weapons in civilian hands. Yeah. And the room was just quiet as could be. And then finally everyone broke into applause. It's amazing to spend time and to see how they've changed the industry. And I would think that FedEx, Joel, plays a big role in your life today. Yeah. What was your path out of Boston into...
So... Yeah, my path was, I would say, more a path of just following really impactful mentors in my life. I didn't really have a plan. Mm-hmm. I went to an okay college in Maine.
Which one?
I don't. Now that I just said it's an okay college, I'm not sure I want to mention it, but it's easy to look up. Anyway, I went to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. So as I like to say to people, not Bowdoin. Multiple people in my family went. I'm 0 for 2 on my first 2 kids, but I've got a third who's in high school. I'm hoping she winds up going to Bates. Yep. Where I was connecting the story was as I was growing up in suburban Massachusetts. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is it was just an ideal suburb of Boston in the 70s where I was growing up. I was actually born in Virginia. I moved there when I was 6 because my dad was coming out of law school when I was born and so forth in Virginia.
And that's quite an interesting career change from him.
Well, I mean, for starters, he was an engineer at MIT, so that's where he went to college. Then a naval aviator, then UVA law, then did some teaching and clerking, and then ultimately found his way up to Boston.
Sounds like a pretty remarkable guy.
He's an interesting guy. I'm fortunate that both my parents are still alive, and they're both fascinating. But the one thing we didn't have is we didn't have a lot of extra money around the house. I mean, I certainly did not grow up privileged
Yep.
or unprivileged, but we worked if we wanted spending money. We kids, there were four of us, and I just found that I had a knack for having conversations with consumers. I didn't really realize that I had a knack until much later in life, but I found myself. I mean, I worked construction.
Did you work retail as a kid?
Yeah, I worked retail. I worked construction. I worked, as a counselor at a baseball camp and a hockey camp and all kinds of stuff. 35 years later, when I go back and reflect on all that from high school forward, I just think about common threads. And one of the common threads, which is why I was fascinated to talk to you about the book, but also to do this podcast, is, to me, you talk about relationships and the importance of relationships. And one of the things that I say in the book, in terms of, especially in the dedication section, is you mentioned Fred Smith and others, Ken Langone, and I'm sure we could list 100 other people. But to me, those were my heroes growing up. I didn't think about sports heroes. I didn't think about movie stars. I wasn't into music or any of that kind of stuff. But I studied the people who I admired and who'd had great success in life, not just in business, but largely in business. And when I merged those two things, this idea of, I have an affinity for building relationships with people, and then I thought about people that have, built industries, changed industries, or whatever, I just kind of felt like I was on a pretty good path, and I wanted to stay in and around the consumer economy. So I was a philosophy major in college, which is an essentially useless degree, but it does teach you how to think, and it teaches you how to write. I got out of college in the teeth of the early 90s recession. I was fortunate enough to get a job at a marketing strategy firm. Any job at that time was a good job. Moved to Manhattan, and I started working for consumer brands back then. And I just kind of kept up with it. I spent about 15 years working for consumer brands. I went to business school in the middle of that. Then about 20 years ago, I joined this little tiny firm called AlixPartners. Jay Alex is the founder of AlixPartners, and he's another guy who invented an industry. So this concept of a Chapter 11, which hopefully you never have to talk about, but this is a whole industry that's been built up over the last 40 years. It didn't exist 40 years ago. Jay and just a couple of other people basically helped write the bankruptcy code and helped develop a legal process where companies could go through an organized process of getting through a financial difficulty and to the other side. But at the time that I met him, I knew I was a fixer of things. I really liked solving complicated problems, and I had worked largely for underperforming consumer brands and kind of helped them improve their performance. Prior to that, the firm he had was still a bankruptcy firm. And I had worked for a company that had been through bankruptcy. And if you've ever had to do that, most people don't ever want to do it once, much less twice. Yeah. So I didn't have any interest in the company at the time. But when I re-met him a couple of years after business school, he had expanded the business from restructuring into solving complex problems for companies, where it was that space in between the strategy consulting and the turnaround world. There's a bunch of people that used to Greg Brenneman, Gordon Bethune, Al Dunlap, whatever. But, these guys were these heroes. They would come in and slash job. But there was nothing in the middle. Yep. There was no consulting in the middle for people that were like me. I had real hands-on consumer experience. And he said, I want to try to build a consulting firm in that white space. And that was compelling to me. So I've been there 20 years, and along with a bunch of other people, have helped build the global retail practice into a pretty big... How big was the firm when you joined? Oh God, I mean, it was probably under 250 million in revenues, and we're well over 5 times that size now, and it was probably 300 people, and we're over 3,000 people now. And so watching that growth has just been tremendous.
Not just watching, I suspect.
Well, participating in that, thank you, but participating in a little bit in that growth has been tremendous.
So Alex has moved away from specializing in bankruptcy to specializing in retail, specializing in companies that deal with the consumer in one way or another.
Yes, although we do have, just a little plug, retail is a very strong industry focus of ours, but we also have lots of other industries covered. We are a full-scale global management consulting firm now. Uh-huh. We are certainly not as big as McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, but we think we punch above our weight, and we're very competitive with them in terms of the services and the breadth of industries we cover. My focus happens to be retail and the consumer, because that's where I've spent my entire life. Yep. That's probably 20% of our firm's business, and so the other 80 is made up in other industries. And of course, we still are the crown jewel in the restructuring space. I mean, our restructuring practice and our practitioners there, they are still the best in the world at that part of the business. But that's just a small piece of AlixPartners now.
So let's take a look at the bankruptcy piece for a second.
Yeah.
I think people generally don't have a good understanding of businesses that forced into a reorganization, what can happen to them, and why the bankruptcy laws were written the way they are, how they become what they are, so as to not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Correct.
And salvage businesses that get in over their head for one reason or another.
That is correct.
What role does Alix play in that process?
Well, so our main focus is the debtor. So we work for companies that are going through bankruptcies. Now, we do creditor work, and we work for unsecured creditors committees, and we do other things that are adjacent to the restructuring world. But the core DNA of AlixPartners is to help companies through this difficult process. We are financial advisors, so we interface with creditors and future sources of capital, which is important. We don't provide legal advice, but we interface with the lawyers because bankruptcy is a very prescriptive legal process. And so we are experts at leveraging that process to the benefit of our clients, which most of the time is the company itself.
Not to throw a lob in front of Jimmy Connors at the net, but I would suspect that the brand that you guys have achieved is beneficial to the debtor. To say that I have Alix working with me, it gets the other people who might not have the best intent for the company to behave better.
The participants in a bankruptcy process pay really close attention when AlixPartners is running the process. Mm-hmm. Let's just say it that way.
It's a benefit to your brand
Yeah.
and the reputation you've earned by playing that role for a long time.
Now, sorry, not to interrupt, but it is also a challenge for our brand for this very reason. All of the consulting clients that we have, which is a significantly larger percentage of our global revenue footprint than the restructuring work. The restructuring work is still it's our heritage, it's a huge part of the business, not to minimize it in any way, but we've scaled through not restructuring work because that market ebbs and flows.
Yep.
But those companies are all private. We don't talk about who our clients are on the consulting side. It's just not done. Bankruptcy is a public process by design. Of course, it's confidential and it's private, and it virtually never leaks. I mean, we have hundreds of clients around the globe right now, and no one knows that any of them are our clients. So confidentiality is very important in our business.
I didn't know you from the bankruptcy practice.
That's great.
So I didn't know of the negative consequence of your good brand in that bankruptcy space.
Nothing makes me happier than to hear that because that's been 20 years of effort.
Yeah, it's very much the case. So I was, very open to a discussion when I met David and other members of your team because I've just been so impressed with your retail insights.
Thank you.
You wrote this book called The Metail Economy, and I like that you come up with this subheading: 6 strategies for transforming your business to thrive in the me-centric consumer revolution. That revolution didn't just start recently; it's ongoing.
Yep.
So take us a look back a little bit at the trends you were seeing that led us to what you think now is a crucible kind of moment where the pendulum's going to accelerate.
Yep. I refer to myself as the unconsultant because I think that, first of all, I didn't grow up in consulting, and AlixPartners is the only consulting firm I ever worked for. But also, I have a healthy skepticism for the kind of traditional consulting type of book, which is just a framework, and if you do this, then you'll be, it doesn't work for my golf game. It's probably not going to work for my company. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think a lot of consultants that write business books really believe in what it is they're saying. I think that they're more part of the shtick or whatever it is. I don't know them. It's not, but that's my view. And I use the word revolution very specifically because I get very tired of hearing about how everything is a revolution. Change is not a revolution. It's just change. Yeah. When I decided to use the word revolution, I realized that it really was because what a revolution to me means is something fundamental has changed and you will never go back to the way that it was before. And so let me just try not to overdo it. But if we think about the retail world that we grew up in, there were a lot of different models, but the main premise was choosers chose. Merchants decided what to put for sale, where, and for how much money, and consumers either bought or they didn't buy. That was kind of the dynamic, and that was the era where you heard the phrase merchant prince, and people that were really lauded for being these merchandising geniuses.
Had the feel,
they just had the touch.
Yeah.
They just knew what consumers wanted.
Yeah,
that instinct. And in that era, that was precisely what needed to be supplied to the marketplace. But what we confused it with, that was true genius. But what we confused that genius with was it was genius because consumers didn't have an opportunity to tell anybody what they wanted or where they wanted it or how they wanted it or how much they wanted to pay.
There was no feedback.
There was no feedback.
Sale or no sale.
So for centuries, and I talk about this in the book, millennia, Commerce, by and large, worked the same way. Somebody made something available for sale. You came and you bought it or you didn't buy it. And e-commerce isn't a revolution. Digital ads isn't a revolution. And social media isn't a revolution. But when you add all of that together and you think that it's only been about 15 years that consumers have had access to these social networks and the internet in a way that allows them to get information. What I say is that consumers now have access not only to information, but they have access to each other. And that's the revolution. So I'm sure you are familiar with the magazine Consumer Reports. We all grew up with Consumer Reports. If you wanted to buy a dishwasher or a car or a stereo, you checked Consumer Reports, and that was the gospel.
That's a good turnaround story.
Yeah. Well, first of all, good turnaround story. So when I was growing up, we cared about Consumer Reports, and now consumers care about consumers' reports. They are not interested in the experts, the merchant princes. They don't care what the experts have to say because they've taken control of the narrative. And that's the me in this me-centric economy that I talk about. That's the me in retail, that concept of the me-centric consumer. But I'm going to go one step further, which is the other concept I introduced in the book is the idea of a quantum consumer. And remember, I said I was a philosophy major, so the last physics class I took was probably 9th grade. But this concept of a quantum particle that can exist in two places at the same time, that's what's happening to the consumer right now because of all the access that they have to technology. So that's the reason. But the impact on companies that are trying to interact with the consumer is I can be two or more different, entirely different consumers at the exact same moment in time. You know, a story I tell in the book is I could be waiting in line to buy really inexpensive gas, and I could be searching for a luxury vacation on my cell phone at the exact same time. And there's no cognitive dissonance for consumers in that anymore. They don't see themselves as two different
luxury
consumers.
might buy their socks at TJ Maxx.
Of course. Lots of them do.
Yeah.
So anyway, the concept of the Metail Economy is that technology is the reason, but it's not the way people usually say. People say, oh, it's the internet. And I say, well, what about the internet? And then it sort of falls apart. Oh, it's e-commerce. Well, what about e-commerce? E-commerce is just commerce, right? The early days of e-commerce, you put something up and I clicked on it and then I got it. But it was no different. That wasn't a revolution. It's the accumulation of all of the social and information technological access that's finally accumulated. And the weight of that has now tipped the scale entirely in the favor of the consumer. And that's the revolution, which is, it used to be that the power dynamic was one way, company to consumer. Companies had all the power. And now consumers have all the power. And if you think about how you would teach young Jim how to build a business in an economy where companies have power, which is the one we grew up in, versus an economy where consumers have power, there's a lot of stuff we would do differently.
We didn't just have a commerce relationship with those people.
That's right.
We got to know them.
You had a relationship with those people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I describe it often as, and when I'm describing it, I'm seeing it in my memory. And the people just stop in and make themselves a cup. We had a little station with coffee and tea, and they'd make themselves a cup of coffee. Yeah. Or they'd stop and chat, look at some arrangements we were making for a party that night. It was a small shop, so everything was
on the table.
To everybody.
Yeah.
Those relationships, and we're using technology today to get as close to those kinds of relationships as we can.
Yeah.
And so when I read through your book a couple of times now, Joel, I'm finding reinforcement to what we're doing instinctually here about saying, if I can mimic those relationships, have genuine dialogues around subjects that we think matter, and we tend to focus on relationships.
As you should. What you're doing as a business is exactly the right thing to do, which is technology can allow you to have relationships, not just with 40 people, which is what it was like back in the day, but with 400, 4,000, 4 million. Yep. But the one thing technology cannot ever replace is a real relationship. There's a difference between a relationship that is built on technologies that allow your consumers to feel like they're getting what they want, how they want. That's very important, not to take anything away from that. But there is a real difference. If we think about our lives, if we think about the list of people that we would say we have a real relationship with, that list is still very, very small. And it's the same thing for businesses. I'm going to come back to mental health in just a minute, but I want to move it sideways for a second, because that's not, there are a bunch of other things, but I want to go back to the evolution of how we used to try to accumulate our customers versus how we have to think about it today. Because the ability to associate yourself with multiple demographics is a very recent phenomenon. Well, the easiest picture of all is there are, I think now, approaching 70 different gender categories on Facebook. If you are going to Facebook right now, you have 70 options, plus or minus, to select. When you and I were growing up, you had 2. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say for better or worse. And this is not a political podcast, and we don't have to make it political. But the point is, it is technology that has allowed these reliable demographics, suburban, 50-year-old, 2.5 kid family making $35,000 a year. Boom, I can target them. This is how they behave. And we thought that was how they behaved because the demographers and the marketing research people were so smart. They weren't. They behaved that way because they didn't have the ability to behave any other way. They didn't know. Maybe they knew, but they couldn't.
And that was access, social constraints, all retarding the people's ability to act beyond the demo.
And so what's happened is these reliable demographics that we used to, they were reliable and we relied on them, right? If you think back to the direct mail days, that was the foundation of it.
If I know your zip code, I know a lot about you.
Exactly. Well, that's not true anymore. Okay, these reliable demographics have fractured and then fractured and fractured and fractured until you get down to a me. And then to make it even worse, there isn't even one me. There's not one Jim. There's not one Joel. Right? This is the quantum Jim, the quantum Joel. We're multiple different people at the exact same time. That is orders of magnitude more complicated for companies to build real relationships with consumers. And that's the premise of the book. And I don't purport to have answers. What I say very early in the book, and I'm sure a lot of people have just closed the cover at that point, is don't read this book thinking I'm going to hand you the answer to this problem. The reason that I wrote the book is that I've spent my entire life working in the consumer economy. The consumer economy is one of the most important, if not the most important, economic driver globally. There are billions of people around the globe that make their living in and around the consumer economy. There's farmers, we talked about Fred Smith and FedEx that move the goods. There's retailers, there's suppliers, there's agencies. It's billions of people and trillions of dollars. This is sort of a wake-up call for everybody that's in the consumer business, because a lot of us, at our vintage are still in leadership positions in these companies, but we don't have any idea how to market to these fragmented quantum me's.
Sure.
Because that's not how we were trained.
Yep. The consequences of that are enormous.
Yeah.
And as you point out in the book, you need to step back and develop a new set of guidelines that you use as you behave. The discovery of your consequences of your behaviors accrue and give you a new roadmap.
That's right. And that's what the 6 C's are. The 6 C's are not answers. I would say they're ingredients in a recipe. You might use 3 and throw out 3. You might use a little bit of all 6. I might use only 1. But what they are it's my distilled wisdom about how you can build real relationships with a consumer. This is not how you build real relationships in a social context or, with your spouse or whatever. But in a consumer world, I feel like, and people have tossed in other ideas, but I feel like these 6 are pretty good ways to think about it. A consumer can think of you and say, yeah, I have a relationship with that company because they are delivering for me on, and then you fill in the blank.
But as you pointed out earlier, Joel, when you follow the path of the challenge your thinking with the 6 C's, it doesn't give you a printout at the end of a picture of the consumer. I wasn't familiar with below 5.
Mm-hmm. Five below. Yeah.
Until last winter. And I stopped to get some wine in Florida, and I had to walk past to get to my car, past a wine store, and there was this Five Below store. Mm-hmm. And so I wandered around it, and I thought it was interesting. Of course, a few things stuck to my hands, and I found myself at their checkout. And that's the first I've seen their stores. Yeah. But you talk about it in the book about how how they're positioning themselves vis-a-vis the TJ Maxx stores, where there's a bit of that discovery and a treasure hunt going on. Yep. Consistency in terms of real value and not trying to trick the customer. So you're a fan of theirs and their positioning.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until in the last couple of years, I thought that Amazon was peeling off the affluent e-commerce customer and Walmart had the rest. I didn't realize that there were 70 or plus million people who can't afford to shop at Walmart.
Oh, yeah.
Who don't have a car, so the parking lot doesn't matter to them.
That's right.
And that's how that whole dollar store industry in an urban setting, but not just, really started to mushroom. I didn't realize there were that many people who couldn't afford to shop at Walmart.
It's very difficult for each of us who are in whatever decile we're in to truly imagine what the life of a person who's in a different decile is actually all about. You know, you mentioned transportation, and that's very near and dear to my heart. And I have a passion for this, and it's probably a separate podcast. But I'm on the board of directors of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Foundation, and one of my missions in life is to try to close this opportunity deficit that we've created over the years, particularly for young Black boys and girls, but also for others. One of the areas that I really focus on is what I call reliable transportation. And if you're in a bottom decile income group, without the access to reliable transportation, you don't have access to the sorts of opportunities that can allow you to begin to close the opportunity deficit. If every time I turn the key to my car, I'm playing Russian roulette with my checking account because I don't know if my starter is going to go out this time, and if it does, that's $500 and that's my savings.
Some of us have been there.
Yeah, exactly. So if I do have reliable transportation, the opportunities to take advantage of opportunities become available to me. So I don't want to belabor the point, but
it is an interesting point, and I wasn't the least bit sensitive to it. And I don't mean to say that I was callous to it, but I wasn't sensitized to it until I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, listened to a podcast, I think it was Freakonomics.
Yeah.
And they talked about transportation. They had a couple of experts on. They were making the point you're making now.
Yeah, I'll actually need to listen to that because I didn't hear it, and that's interesting.
I think it was UCLA is the hotbed of academic knowledge around transportation. Of course, they were chatting a lot about Boston to Kansas City, which has gone to a free access transportation system. So we have some laboratory-esque situations going on that'll tell us a lot in the next weeks, months, and maybe years about access.
Very much. Complete non sequitur, or maybe semi sequitur, but
back
to Five Below for just a second. First of all, you should know Tom Velios, the founder of Five Below. First of all, I just can tell you would love him, but he's also, you talk about a founder, and he's an amazing human being. I'd be happy to introduce you. But
love it.
The genius of Five Below, and the point I make in my book is, until Tom came along and his team, people perceived the dollar store category as a dollar store category. Tom's genius is that he realized it's not the dollar that's magic. It's the confidence and comfort of knowing you're not going to get suckered into something that's more. Mm-hmm. And so Five Below basically said, okay, well, I mean, $1 is not a lot of money. So there's a certain set range of stuff you can sell for $1. Now, most dollar stores sell stuff more than $1 now, but you're talking about 20 years ago. Yep. And his genius was, and I have no idea what his genius was. This is just my perception of it. Was he thought, well, what if it's $5? Right? What could we sell if it's $5? And it turns out you can sell a lot of different categories, fun categories. And so in terms of inventing a category, he didn't invent the dollar store category, but he reinvented it and he redefined it. I mean, we had 5 and dime stores when I was growing up, and those don't exist anymore.
No. Back to the Five Below example. And I know you're a big fan of Target too. I've checked out a couple of your other video interviews you've done, and I've heard you opine about Target and some of the things they're doing really well. I think there's a misconception, maybe particularly in the investor community, about retail and where it's going. Mm-hmm. People saying, retail, I'm not even going to look at it. I'm saying, wait a minute. I think that might be an overreaction, and I think you might miss some opportunities because retail done well, Five Below, Target, others that you've mentioned, is an unbelievably good way of building a brand.
Yep.
Because now your marketing billboard, a store, is profitable. That's the best marketing in the world.
Absolutely.
So do you think, tell us what you think about the future of retail, how it will evolve in the near term.
I'll circle back to Target in a second because it really does hinge on your question about the investors versus the business people. Just to get right at it, I am incredibly bullish about retail as an industry in the medium term. Yes, I think we're going to head into a consumer recession, in the next 18 to 24 months, maybe last 12 to 24 months. I would say in the investor community right now, which is then kind of driving pessimism in the operator community related to this holiday season. So let's go really short term, which is this holiday season. Then let's go short term, which
holiday
is 2023, right? And then let's talk about retail in the medium to long term. So I'm extremely bullish on retail in the medium to long term. I'm also very bullish on brick and mortar stores. I think things will be slightly different.
Be bullish short term, medium term, and long term. Yet you're telling me there's going to be a recession.
I'm bullish short term and medium and long term. Yeah. So whatever is in between those two, that's the recessionary period, which will help reset some things.
If you anticipate them and you're properly prepared for them, don't need to be fatal.
They absolutely shouldn't be fatal because this is going to be the least surprising recession that will surprise people, at least in my career.
Because the Fed has to squeeze out this excess cash we printed, and I would say for very good reasons.
Yeah.
I've said this before. I think the Fed saved the world economy in March and April of 20 when they said, well, we're the buyer of last resort. I can give you a secret. I know how recessions are created. Excess printing of money by governments. Number one, by a bullet, and there isn't a number 2 or 3. Yeah. It's the only reason. And clearly, the Fed and legislatively, we printed a lot of money in the last couple of years. I think for good reasons in the beginning, and I think cynically for political reasons later on. And now they got to squeeze it out. So that's why you're saying this is so predictable.
That's what I'm saying. This is as predictable as this bullwhip that we're experiencing in the consumer economy where retailers rushed to get stuff in earlier and they overordered and now they're discounting goods. We can come back to that. But let's just talk about the very short term.
Idiots, Joel. I mean, we didn't know when this was going to end. So the department stores that said, oh, my God, I got to have more swimsuits, they weren't wrong.
No, it's a very nuanced question. Yeah. We can get to it in a second. But I really want to I want to hit the short term, which is the consumer balance sheet right now. If you listen to Jamie Dimon or you listen to Moynihan at Bank of America or you listen to the people who actually have the data, what they're telling us is that consumers today, right now, well, last quarter, so very recently, if you took any decile, consumers that had $0 to $500 in their bank account pre-recession, they have 500 to 1,000 now. Consumers in the next decile have twice as much savings. Consumer in the next decile has twice as much savings. And because...
Yet, the number of people who can't put their hands on $400 in an emergency has increased as a percentage of the population.
I'm somewhat skeptical of that statistic. I've seen it a lot. I think right now, today, I trust the data from the banks rather than the survey data.
And I heard Jane Fraser from Citicorp say that today's deposits, total deposits, are $3.4 trillion. Consumer deposits. Last year, it was $3 trillion. So there's been a $400 billion increase in deposits, which speaks to the point you're making.
Yeah, and I think pre-pandemic, the $3 trillion or whatever would have been 2 something. Right. So my point is, and it's a very small point, but when the data I care about, because I think the data that drives consumption is 2 pieces. There's how confident do I feel about the future? That's very important, okay? And I do think there will be a lot of pessimism, a lot of doom and gloom talk. But at the end of the day, I've been doing this for 35 years, so not as long as you, but a long time. Consumers that have money spend money, and that's all there is to it. And consumers have money. So I don't think this is going to be a bad holiday season. I don't think it's going to be... Last year, all the predictions were 5 or 6% growth. AlixPartners, my team, we predicted 12.5. It came in at about 14, 13, something like that. For similar reasons, my guess is everyone's going to predict flat this year.
What's your forecast?
We haven't finished it yet, so we got a lot of data left to do. But my gut tells me it's going to be mid to high single digits because the consumer is still strong. Now, that is a macro prediction, right? And of course, segments are going to perform differently.
One little anecdote.
Yeah.
A guy I know started his own business, took it public. His stock is down 60% in the last year. I was in a conversation with him, and he was making winter vacation plans and hesitant to make them because he felt poorer. He's not poor.
Right. That's the
got
wealth
a lot of
effect
money.
for the
It's that
1%.
psychological impact of anyone who's looking at their E-Trade account, their Ameritrade account, their JP Morgan account is saying, "Oh my goodness, I just got my net worth cut in half."
That's true, but that phenomenon applies to the tiniest sliver of the consumer economy.
So not meaningful in
Virtually
in the aggregate.
nobody that actually drives the consumer economy even has an Ameritrade account. Yeah, that's the bulk of the, we have the 0.1%, we have the 1%. I'm sure you've heard of the 9.9%, and then you have the 81 or 82%.
So the psychological hangover doesn't really affect the people who actually drive the economy.
Obviously, if there is some catastrophic fall off in jobs between now and the holiday season, what I'm saying goes out the window. But I don't see any trigger for that.
No.
So whatever I was doing last year, I'm either doing something different and making more money, or I'm doing the same and making more money, or I'm doing the same and making the same money, but my costs have gone down because I'm not commuting to work. I'm not buying lunch every day. So I feel wealthier. It's the same wealth effect than I felt before. You said something about self-fulfilling prophecy. There is a little bit of that.
Yes.
If the media is vocally pessimistic, the thing that makes, I don't need to tell you this, but the thing that makes it difficult for public companies to truly decide who they are and how they want to manifest themselves and the relationships they want to build with their customers is the investor community. It is very difficult to invent, reinvent, or reshape a real public company that's faced with quarterly demands and EPS and all that other sort of stuff. Brian Cornell, when he got to Target, he basically did something that I can't think of very many CEOs that have done of a multi-billion-dollar public company. He said, I don't care what the investors think. I care what my customers think. And my customers are telling me they want cleaner stores, they want better signage, they want easier access, they want curbside pickup, they want 1 hour delivery. He listened to the customers, and the customers told him what they wanted. That's not the hard part. The hard part is he invested billions of dollars in his stores 10 years ago.
When everyone said stores are history.
Not just everyone. Wall Street said, you're crazy.
Who provides
Stores
the
are
capital.
dead.
Yeah.
This is nuts. This is crazy. And over that period of time, Target has outperformed all of their competitors on every metric. Even recently with the inventory miss that they had, and Walmart had their inventory miss. We don't want to confuse turbulence for poor strategy.
Yep.
There's always turbulence, but a strategy is a 5 and 10 year journey. And he set a 10-year journey that was customer driven, and he stuck to it.
Do they have a different kind of relationship with their consumers?
They say
Target.
right. They make it French and fun, and and I would venture to say, if you had to choose between having consumers refer to you as Target or refer to you as Stuff Mart or Wally World or whatever people say about Walmart, I think on balance, you'd rather have the consumer asset of people that call you Target. Now, that can still be squandered if it's not caretaken well. Brian has done a beautiful job of caretaking that company.
I think there are opportunities in retail for companies to do interesting things that would seem bold right now because of this throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I couldn't agree with you more. This is a perfect opportunity for real retail businesses that truly understand the shape-shifting consumer and the opportunity to be first in their category or first in their region or first in their local space or whatever. First to provide those customers what they want. And it's not the sexy stuff. It's not the stuff that's going to be popular. By and large, business people and investors are herds. It's very lonely, and it can be really dangerous to stay outside of the herd.
Yes.
So you have to have a lot of internal intestinal fortitude. I mean, this is rich, me saying this to you, right, with what you've accomplished in your career. I don't need to tell you this or give you this advice, but I'm talking to, hopefully, lots of other people who have not done what you've done.
Now, during the depths of COVID, we shuttered 40-plus retail stores on our Harry and David brand. But I didn't like the idea of where we were. And when we had to close, our e-commerce business took off. So we didn't know how long those stores are going to be closed. We have a lot of perishable inventory in those stores. So the decision was made, let's focus our energies on something we know well and was absolutely on fire for us, which was the e-commerce business.
Yes.
But I miss retail. We have a couple of retail stores, and I'd still like to go back and test and play with retail.
Yeah.
Because as we chatted about before, when we have a beautiful retail store on a nicely trafficked location, our e-commerce business is better in those zip codes.
Yep.
That zip code and the
They
adjoining
go
zip
hand in
codes.
hand. They absolutely go hand in hand.
And when we query the customer,
Yeah.
to say how often do you go, oh, I go in there all the time. They don't.
They don't.
They
Yeah.
think they do.
Right.
But their e-commerce spending goes up because we become not just a long distance sender of gifts, but we become their florist and gift and their friend.
Yeah. The community piece requires you to think about, how do I build a community? And then leveraging, knowing that that will help you build a business, not the other way around. But the reason you believe that, I would postulate, is because you believe in the power of a community.
Absolutely.
And that's the point.
But along my educational journey, I remember
Yes.
sitting next to a young man with flip-flops and a T-shirt at an Allen and Company conference in Arizona back 12 plus years ago.
Yeah.
And he said to me, "Sir, I think when you say community, you're still thinking about a physical place. And when I say community, I'm thinking about people with a common interest." And that was Mark Zuckerberg, who I didn't know who the heck he was at the time. But
Yeah.
I told my wife when I got home, boy, I met this brash young guy. And boy, he was one of the smartest people I've ever met. And he went on to be pretty successful,
Yeah, pretty
I've noticed.
successful.
And I have a friend who's a great teacher of communication skills. And I've always said to him, "Jack, you should write a book." And he said, "No, I don't want to give away my secrets." I said, "I think the world has changed, Jack.
Yeah.
Because I think you can give away your secrets,
Yeah.
and people will then give you the credibility and want the personalized version of it."
Nobody believes me when I say this, because I guess it's just rare. I did not write this book to market myself or AlixPartners. I wrote this book because I've spent my entire career in the consumer industry, and it's changing. And if we don't figure out the change and do something about it, it's going to be worse for a lot of people. That was my motivation. It wasn't, I don't want to be famous. I don't want to be I happened to be a best-selling author, which was very nice, but that's not why I did it. I didn't do it for the money. Trust me, there's no money in business books unless you make it your life. Of course I knew it would help my brand. Of course I knew it would help my company's brand, our practice's brand, but it wasn't the motivation. What it has done for us is it has allowed us to have different conversations with people that are in the consumer economy. AlixPartners has a particular expertise and a particular reputation, but like all businesses, your business isn't the business that people think it is, because they only have one little lens into it. And we aren't that way either, but brands evolve over time. This has really elevated the conversation for AlixPartners. It's put AlixPartners in the mix for the kinds of things that CEOs and boards used to just pick up the phone and call the strategy firms for, because they aren't getting this from the strategy firms. And you talk about the emails we put out. We started those almost 15 years ago, and it's my passion. And I read every single one. I used to write them all for 5 to 6 years. I wrote them all, and now other people contribute. But the point was, I said, if it is not provocative, we are not putting it out there. Yep. If we are not saying something different, if all we're doing is reporting the news or doing some thin strategy, oh, it's all about the cloud, or you need to be digital, or, it's all about personalization, say, forget it. Okay, because the only way we're going to build real relationships with customers is if they believe that we have something differentiated to say. And that's what I'm trying to reinforce in the book. There aren't any business books out there where people are as directly critical of as many retail businesses for making mistakes that are not fatal, but most consultants won't even name names in books.
Sure.
But if they do, it's all about, oh, this one's handsomer than the next, and this one's taller than the next, and whatever. And that's not what this book is at all. I mean, there are a bunch of retailers in this book where I hope the CEOs call me because I can help them not make the mistakes that they do, but I don't expect them to, because I'm fairly critical of them and their strategies right now.
I've watched some of the things you've said about in years gone by about Bed Bath & Beyond, and oh, how prescient you were. There's so many interesting stories going on out there in the landscape, and but I hope our community has gotten to know a little bit more about you
Thank
today,
you.
Joel, and about your passion, which is clear, and your depth of knowledge, which is extraordinary. So if you it may not been your goal to raise the profile of Joel Bynes and of AlixPartners, but it's worked in spite of your efforts. And I think there's a lot of people who will get a whole lot of reading the Metail Economy. I have 20 other areas I'd like to go down the path with. I know we're out of town.
I can come back.
And let's do that, because we haven't even gotten into personalization yet and about what people are going to do in an augmented reality kind of world. The change is exhausting.
I agree. But thank you for having me. This was really,
Thank you for helping us
to
to try and at least have a map of all this change around us.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate it.